Hi, and welcome to episode 3 of the Center of the Rainbow Circle. This is my co host, Bo. I should have some sort of fancy intro, like with this as just to explain where the Rainbow Circle comes from. Just pulling this up here all the time is kind of silly. Um, Having animals in my face all the time is kind of silly too. I conceived of doing these videos partly, one of the main motivations was wanting to get down all my ideas about how creative writing works, how stories work, in case I never get a chance to teach it. And videos is trying to write it is a daunting task when I just want to write stories. So recording it is the simplest way to make sure I get those ideas down, because this is a concept I've been developing for decades, but I've never really come around to telling people about it. But also there's a consciousness of mortality, because I have Crohn's disease, so I'm always thinking about, how much longer do I really have? Not that there's any realistic reason to think that way, just a psychological thing. But there are happy reasons to be alive. One of them is my son Callum, of course. That's the number one. Another one is all these animals that always show up in my videos. I could just shut that door, but I don't, just because I love them. And I think it's funny. But the other good reason to be alive in 2019 is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Anybody who knows me knows how I feel about that. But it actually gives great examples of some important issues with storytelling. There's actually way too much to talk about. So I do want to just narrow it down to really maybe 2 or 3 things. Because I could talk about that for hours and hours and hours. But in order to really communicate some of my essential ideas that from the Rainbow Circle, from this thing, I'll just narrow it down to a handful of things. But it is really an important and valuable and amazing thing to be alive in this golden age of Marvel comics on film. I've been a huge Marvel fan since 1991, when this story came out, the Infinity Gauntlet. I thought it'd be cheesy and wear the shirt, even though it's summer in South Carolina, so it's very hot right now. The need to be cheesy was so overwhelming that I'm very hot right now, but that's okay. But my favorite characters in any medium, just right away, and as soon as I read the Infinity Gauntlet, were Doctor Strange, Adam Warlock, and Thanos. The fact that the MCU even exists is a miracle. The fact that Thanos is a household name now is amazing. Never thought any of that would happen. But I think it also brings up one of my frustrations with the way people talk about how stories work and communicate how stories work. And I base this on creative writing textbooks, creative writing lectures, classes I've taken. All of them, I was really desperate to find something, and I just failed over and over again. Well-meaning people, mostly 90%, very nice people, but they were just wrong, and what they said just didn't work. And so that's why I came up with the Rainbow Circle. And really this year, I sort of stumbled into behavioral economics. I'm not an economics person. I don't know math very well. I can't explain most of it, but I binged a lot of behavioral economics books this year for some reason. So I'm not. If I'm totally wrong about any of this, this is just a brand new thing for me. But there's so many terms in behavioral economics that explain why people communicate about stories so badly. People who should be really good at language are really come short in talking about how stories work for thousands of years. But one of them is, unfortunately, called the storytelling fallacy. So I do want to come up with a better term for that and actually applying it to stories. You can't say we misunderstand stories because of the storytelling, applying the storytelling fallacy to stories. That doesn't make any sense. So the way that it really applies, the MCU is a perfect example of that, because the storytelling fallacy, the way it basically works is that you experience something new, or you have some sort of emotional experience, and you tend to have these automatic responses, and you sort of make up the story about why you have these, an explanation of why you have these responses, and it becomes so entrenched that you'll get defensive of that initial response to it. And unfortunately, the way that works is it becomes dualistic false universals, which is a bit of a mouthful. Storytelling fallacy sounds nice. Dualistic false universals, I think, is a bit more, accurate in application, or not as redundant seeming in application to storytelling. And that's sort of where the rainbow circle comes in. Here it is, right here. The handy dandy visual clue. Because the center of the rainbow circle, that's the drive towards stimulation, towards feeling any sort of feeling. So feeling some sort of intense feeling. It's why we, just using the MCU as an example, it's why we go to see, any sort of movie, to have this intense feeling, whether it's good or bad. So I cry very easily. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I cried like a baby. My favorite of the MCU movies is Guardians of the Galaxy 2. But Endgame this year, cried like a baby. And, in both those cases, it's because of these characters dying. So why would I want to experience that? It's because I'm drawn to these intense feelings. Whether or not they're good or bad, I'm drawn to these intense negative feelings or positive feelings. That's irrational to be drawn to positive feelings, so there's this counterforce towards rationality on the outer rim. The center is non-dualistic, so you can have intense negative feelings and intense positive feelings all wrapped up together. The outer rim is dualistic and rational, and striving after things that are universally true. But it becomes these dualistic false universals. So you'll get, these think pieces about the end of cinema that say Marvel is killing movies or whatever. And a lot of the response, the negative response, clearly I'm, very, very much on the end of the spectrum with the positive response, but the rationale for the negative response tends to rely on dualities like comic book movies versus good movies, that sort of thing. Popcorn movies versus art movies. I think probably the most ridiculously inaccurate one, by far, the one that drives me crazy, is character-driven versus plot-driven. As if those are opposite things. And I think everyone who loves arguably, I'm getting into universals, probably the one of the few that gets the closest to universal, although it's not truly universal, and I'll get to that. But the most people who truly love the MCU, the reason they love it is because of the characters. So character-driven versus plot-driven is just a ridiculous, easily disprovable oversimplification. Most stories that people truly love are character-driven. And And if you want to take a look at the MCU, why it's really so successful is because of this falling in love with these characters and seeing these characters as they progress through the story, the multiple stories. So, and can't quite divide it in character driven and plot driven. So, and I think probably the example that most drives this home, I do want to get into some of the specific characters shortly, especially in regards to Endgame, which is sort of the end point of a lot of the characters as they've developed. But the example, I think, that drives home just how demonstrably false that whole false duality is the Oscars last year when Black Panther was up against all of these artistic films. Arguably, you had this anomaly of this fluffy popcorn sci-fi fantasy movie couldn't possibly win or what have you. And then Green Book won. But really, by every measure possible, with the exception of the Oscars, with every measure possible, Black Panther really was the best movie of the year. I mean, it was the highest grossing movie of the year, the most critically acclaimed. Those two things cohered in an impossible way. The most culturally pervasive in so many different ways. Yet Green Book won the Oscar. Now, I have a whole obsession, with the Oscars going back to the 90s. And I'm sure, there's a lot of really interesting, fascinating examples like that just in the history of the Oscars, but that's a whole other video. But that's just a real basic example. There are good movies and there are popular movies, and those two are two different things. Not to veer off too much, but another obsession lately is Stanley Kubrick documentaries. But if you think of an example like 2001: A Space Odyssey, that is an example of a beautiful, wonderful, amazing, one of the greatest movies of all time. Everybody agrees. No, most people agree. But not based on characters. That's one of the few examples. So pretty much anything you claim to be universal, you can find an exception to it. But that 2001: Space Odyssey was the highest grossing movie of 1968. Probably widely considered the best movie of 1968, with the exception maybe of Night of the Living Dead. Night of the Living Dead was like 9th highest grossing movie of the year. Neither of them won Oscars. But the Oscar thing can be distracting. But the whole concept of that duality between good movies and popular movies is just that is just a false universal, yet people are just entrenched. And the whole idea, this is another issue, but the whole idea of originality versus novelty. Any sort of writer is going to fall somewhere on a spectrum of originality and novelty. Stanley Kubrick was very interested in, especially 2001, was very interested in finding novel ways to create stories. And a lot of the MCU movies, they can be formulaic, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. That's not a universal bad. It's what you do with the formula that's more effective. There are plenty of highly original movies. There's Siku. He was going to come along and probably block my screen any second now. And breathe really heavily. There are plenty of highly original movies that are just not really good movies, but except for being original. But just as a writer, I'm really interested in highly original things. And one reason I'm very interested, blocking the screen. Hey, buddy, you gonna be my co-host? one reason I'm interested in the MCU, or it sort of comes from the comics, but it's something that the MCU does very well is the interconnectedness of multiple, essentially standalone stories that connect, but sort of cycle through different arcs, story to story, which is something that I try to do. And I studied plenty of more sophisticated and fancy. Fancy is the word I always use because I'm not very fancy. Um, so any non-fancy person, the term they use for high-class things is fancy. Um, I studied plenty of fancy things that do that. That have interconnected characters. Eugenie Ionesco is my biggest hero by far. If I list all my heroes, I have Eugenie Ionesco, Jim Starlin, Stan Lee, Steve Ditko. Those are all my heroes because a lot of what they were doing was experimental, but it gets simplified into, based on this storytelling fallacy, this dualistic false universal, into being, you have the good and you have the bad, which is ridiculous. Those four highly influential people, Louise Erdrich. I've been meaning to talk about Louise Erdrich eventually. Oh, that's in another room. My whole Louise Erdrich shelf is in another room. But that whole idea of an interconnected, a shared universe, that's not unique to comic book universes, but they do it one of the most complicated ways. So, people will say comic book stories are so simplified. And yet, part of the brilliance of the structure of them is that they can come off as very simplified. But if you talk about the MCU, you're talking about 22, I should know this by now, but 22 movies at this point. 22 movies that are interconnected in these really complicated ways while simultaneously functioning as a satisfying standalone movie. Arguably, I don't know. I mean, I'm so entrenched in it. I don't know if they really function that way. I haven't heard a whole lot of complaints about it. I've heard people say, I haven't seen the other movies, but the Captain America: Winter Soldier, it's one of the best ones, but or Ant-Man, or one of the across the spectrum of the best, whatever. They'll say Ant-Man was funny. I didn't quite get all the references to. I didn't know who the Falcon was when he showed up or whatever. But it was still a good movie. So, and that's a complicated, really difficult thing to pull off. Yet that dualistic false universal kicks in, and people say, "Well, they're simple. Good movies are complicated. MCU is simple. It's not simple at all. Very, very complicated. Something like Endgame, just the amount of referencing is to other MCU movies, not just comic books. Most of those characters have been continuously written about since the 1960s. Some of them to the 40s and 50s. But of course, it's ridiculously complicated. Yeah, the dualistic false universal says it must be on the simple end of the spectrum because it can function very simply on one level. But that's just easy to demonstrate that it's not simple storytelling. So let me get to the character part, because I think that this actually links to the other things I was talking about. I think the strength of the characters, and I'll talk about Captain America, Iron Man, and Thanos. Although Thanos is one of my favorite characters of all time since 1991. So there's a lot to say about Thanos, and it feels like it needs to be another video. Doctor Strange, another one of my favorite characters, probably needs to be another video. But I'll touch on Thanos. It's hard to avoid him. We're talking about Endgame especially. But it sort of links to what I was talking about before. I started off just saying, one of the most useful things to do as a writer and in dealing with characters is to certainly deal with their emotions, and then in terms of a linear storyline, their emotions play out as a desire, something they want to fulfill. This is where the rainbow circle comes in. I'll figure out a better way to do this, but right at the center, there's the churning, non-dualistic emotions, undifferentiated tissue, as William S. Burroughs says. I'm sure I'll do a video about Burroughs too. Another one of my heroes, William S. Burroughs, over here. Jim Starlin over here. Not as dissimilar as you might think. Not two dualistic camps. But they have undifferentiated tissue, so it can develop into anything. To develop it as a character into a linear structure, it's framed in terms of a desire to achieve something. Not always, of course. 2001 is a great example. What do Frank and Dave want? Kind of non-characters there. Usually, and if you're structuring the story as a story in this linear, from point A to point B sort of approach, it's a desire. And you'll see this in creative writing text. I mean, this is an example of the sort of thing that drives me crazy. You'll have writers who say, a good character wants something, a bad character doesn't want something. I think I mentioned this last video. Sure, you can get a false positive by saying the fault in this character is that he or she doesn't want something. Give this person a desire, and it will seem like it's increasing the character's emotional complexity or what have you, and engagement from the reader, and this perpetuates this false universal of this dualistic false universal that good characters want something, bad characters don't. And there's plenty of ways to disprove that. MCU is not a great one to disprove it, because all the characters have this really rich desire. But why does that work? I mean, that's a lot of what's missing, is a good character should want something and should try to achieve it. But why? Hold on just a second. Okay, not eating something vital. Okay. You hear sounds of eating. That's Siku. Okay, desire. Oh, hi, Bo. So that's a fine starting point. So if you have a character that just comes churning out of that, emotional cauldron of undifferentiated tissue, figuring out what the character wants and how the character wants to get it, perfectly fine place to start. It can lead you to positive places, but it's not an actual universal. It sort of fools you into believing it's a universal. A really rich way to develop the character, and I'll say this is a good thing to do and not a universal thing to do, but a good thing to do. Bo agreed. Do you agree, Bo? She's not doing it now, of course. Is to find the paradox of the character, and that's what I was just talking about. I mean, if I had, if somebody was starting a story and I said, and they said, what should I do to start off the story? I would say, find out what the character wants and what's the opposite of what the character wants. And so, I was looking at Robin Williams' characters. The anniversary of his death is coming up. As I said, I cry at everything. I'm unapologetically sentimental, so that's why Robin Williams appeals to me so much. But a lot of his characters, the paradox is that mask that he has of that wild, crazy, manic, comedic side. It's always finding these associations between things, but really hiding this intensely vulnerable sort of character where, he's capable of, these funny observations and funny associations, but he's also capable of this, really intense emotions, and it's the counterpoint between those two things. Essentially, the desire is to entertain by making someone laugh, and the counterpoint is to draw away and to, not to make himself less vulnerable, to put an armor up, if you can see where this is leading. But the character who parallels that kind of character is Iron Man, of course. who has that cocky persona of quips all of the time. Sort of like the Robin Williams characters, but always more sarcastic and cruel and that sort of thing, and distancing. But he's putting an armor up around himself. That relates to the correlatives, which is part of level. Not the issue. Sorry. I have too many animals. I'm surrounded by animals right now, which is a great place to be in life, to be surrounded by mammals. But you have the visceral, the paradoxical, the schematic, which is a great thing to talk about with MCU. We're getting into all these complicated things to talk about. And right after that, you have what I call the psychological, which I don't think it's not a great, that's sort of like the storytelling fallacy. I need to find better language for that eventually. But I call it the psychological because it's the break between so-called tangible reality and the story world. So it's sort of the break between the two types of abstraction. I'll get into that later. Maybe. But correlatives function as an echo between the different layers. So if you have a physical object within the story, it can echo something within the character psychology. Another thing that I think is a word that's misused a lot is metaphor, which I'll get into that later. That's a whole complicated thing. But a lot of people will say the Iron Man armor is a metaphor for Tony Stark's deep insecurities, and what his abrasive personality is also manifest as this armor. As the armor is a metaphor for his abrasive personality. And sure, whatever. But I think the term metaphor is. The word metaphor is a bit abused, but that's a whole complicated thing. Not for today. But simple technique to use is the correlative. And comic books do that in really overt ways. And that's the sort of thing. It's such an obvious thing that that's one of the reasons why I think people observe the simplicity of the story and stuff like that. Which is fine. On one level it is very simple, but on another level it is extremely complicated. But so you have Iron Man as that sort of character. And you have all these mini arcs. If you look at the whole structure of how his character develops from movie to movie, and then the whole trajectory, he has these mini arcs, and then the whole trajectory from his first movie to Endgame, it is this really complicated sort of character development from this. Again, Siku's eating something, but I think it's okay. Okay. This complicated development from being really abrasive to other people, being wanting to distance other people, wanting to separate himself from other people, creating this Iron Man armor, and you can see from movie to movie, like the second movie, which a lot of people hate the second movie, but a lot of the value of that one is the way that he's dealing. Oh, the third one. Oh crap! Sorry, the third one. Jeez, I'm getting them all mixed up. Is the way he's dealing with the ways he feels vulnerable from the events of the Avengers movie, the PTSD you might call it. Don't want to misdiagnose that, but essentially he's dealing with the trauma that he experienced in the Avengers, and that manifests in the second Avengers movie when he creates Ultron. All of this sort of stuff, all of these different things are outcroppings of his feeling of vulnerability. He has this open heart. He has all of these different things that really highlight his vulnerability and his resistance to being vulnerable. That really defines him as a character. And then, by Endgame, he has a family. Spoiler alert on all this sort of stuff, of course. I imagine, my audience being maybe my grandchildren, and that maybe is it. But, just full disclosure, I hope other people find this valuable, but maybe just my grandchildren. I have no idea. Um, so, grandchildren, when you're looking back at the great cinema of 2019, but anyway, where was I? Getting distracted. So Iron Man, yes, there you go. So he has this big arc, into the last moment. I am inevitable. I'm Iron Man. Um, and so two things that I would say are false universals that commonly come up when people talk about what makes a good story. Things that are just inaccurate, demonstrably inaccurate when it comes to good storytelling. They're common, they're just not universal. They're not true in all cases. One of them is that actual arc itself. That arc is a great arc. It's an amazing, beautiful character arc for a character over a decade. Which just imagine that. Imagine that. Compare that to a single movie where you have an arc like that. Compare that to a decade and 22 movies, or how many ever movies Iron Man was in. And then calling that simple. That's not simple. It's not simple at all. Anyway, but the whole idea of an arc, the arc, when he sacrifices himself at the end of Endgame, the ultimate act of vulnerability. He was always afraid of vulnerability. The ultimate act of vulnerability. That's the resolution of the paradox, but that's not the purpose. I think that's the biggest mistake that people make when talking about endings of stories. The ending is not the same as the purpose. The story itself, the interest in Iron Man as a character, is in his lack of resolution of his paradox of the vulnerable character who's constantly unwilling to embrace his own vulnerability and is constantly walling himself off. It'll break down and build back up and break down and build back up until the ultimate breaking down. That's the resolution of the paradox. That's the end of the story, but that's not the purpose. So the story of Iron Man is not about him embracing his vulnerability. It's about him failing to embrace his vulnerability, and then the ending is just him embracing. It's the resolution of what the actual story is. And that's his drive. His drive is to, negotiate between these two things that don't quite fit together. But to actually have a story, he needs to not really be able to work those out really effectively. And so Captain America, the perfect counterpoint to Iron Man, is similar to the sort of character I was talking about last time, like Jude Foley. Very different in many, many ways, but like Jude Foley, like Don Quixote. Do you agree, Siku? Yes, you agree. Like Jude Foley, like Don Quixote, like Perry from The Fisher King, where they're ideological, but the story's not about their ideology. It's about the inability of their ideology to actually succeed. And then the actual end of the story. This is, a lot of superheroes. This is how their story, the trajectory of their story. The end of their story is the ideology finally working out. The whole story is the ideology, believing in it and finding evidence that their ideology is not going to succeed, and worrying that their ideology is not going to succeed, and then the ideology succeeding. Horton the Elephant was the other example I used last time. Just like Horton the Elephant. A person's a person no matter how small, of course that's true, but the actual story is all of these forces that try to force Horton to accept that he should just give up on his little world. And that's true of Captain America, who, in Captain America, he has a couple of perfect lines. I don't like bullies. I'm going to knock the phone over. Okay. I don't like bullies being, I would say that would be, it's the American ideals, of course that's what Captain America stands for, but you can take all those complicated ideals and boil it down to that one idea. And the reason he doesn't like bullies is he started off as this little guy who has these overwhelming belief systems, that lead him to protect people, but he gets beaten up anyway. So he's a very vulnerable character. Also, but his shield, there's the correlative right there, of course, a very blatant one. But his shield is his ideology and something being right. So story by story, he faces all of these examples of corruption in America and what have you, and that's sort of the appeal of the Captain America character generally. Not that necessarily that he fights for the American way, but he has this. Most of the '60s stories, the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby stories about Captain America, not the original ones, but the '60s ones, those were about Captain America facing all of these ways in which America had become corrupted, and all of these challenges to his belief that the American way will win out and what have you. And that's what the story is. Once the American way wins out, the story's over, or what have you. But I think the MCU especially boils a lot of that down to just that whole idea of not liking bullies. I could do this all day. The different versions of that catchphrase coming up over and over again. Just echoing each other over multiple movies, which is just perfect. He meets corruption in this government agency through the infiltration of Hydra. He has to turn against his one friend to protect another friend. All of these different things. The basic ideology doesn't quite work. He has to figure out how to make it work. And that's the struggle. And by the end, he's standing up to Thanos, and I'll get to Thanos in a second. Could easily be its own video. But he gets to Thanos, who is the ultimate bully, and he stands up to him regardless. And Infinity Gauntlet, that was like the moment everybody remembers most fondly. And that's echoed in Endgame. Not the exact same way, but it's echoed in Endgame. Whenever, Thanos beats everybody, and then the last person standing is Captain America, who stands up regardless, no matter what, even though it's hopeless. And then, the turn in there is that he ends up becoming, finally by the end, he embraces his selfishness. So they sort of switch. Iron Man and Captain America sort of switch places, where once he's actually succeeded, he gets back with Peggy and he lives a normal life. But for Thanos, my favorite character, and I'll tell that to people sometimes, that Thanos has been my favorite character since 1991. They'll say, "Oh, how can you possibly like a horrible character like that?" I don't agree with him. I like Thanos more than Captain America. I've never really been a big fan of the Captain America comic. I love Captain America in the MCU. I've never been a big fan of the comic. I like it fine. It's just not my favorite. I agree with Captain America, just like I agree with Horton. That doesn't really, affect necessarily how much I like the character. I don't agree with Thanos. It's just he's a more interesting character. But one of the ways that might be a problem in talking about characters in this way of a paradox of just two things that are opposing each other, that's not the only way to do it. It doesn't have to be vulnerability versus the abrasive armored personality, what have you. It could be like Thanos, where if you're talking about what is Thanos' motivation, he has maybe 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, I don't know, depending on which comic you read. But in the MCU, he works perfectly as a counterpoint to Captain America, especially. Captain America has this ideology. He's constantly shielding himself with the ideology of truth, what have you. And getting beaten down and, continuing to stand up. Thanos has this ideology, but he also has all the power. And part of the reason you sympathize with Thanos, even though what he's doing is, awful, of course, indefensible, is that he feels like, he feels like he's beholden to this ideology no matter what. That he has to sacrifice everything. Captain America, we don't make the sacrifice play, or whatever he says. I've only seen Endgame once. I loved it, but I've only seen it once. We don't make the sacrifice play, and then Thanos says, the Infinity Gauntlet. That is in Infinity War. No, that's in Infinity War. I've seen that a couple times. I'm getting them all mixed up. But in Infinity War, Captain America says, we don't make the sacrifice play, and Thanos, what did you sacrifice? Everything. That sort of thing. We sympathize with him, for many, many reasons, of course, but one of the reasons is because he feels so beholden to this ideology that he seems like he's in great pain to fulfill this ideology, losing Gamora and what have you. And that sort of, it's the dark mirror sort of idea. And Stan Lee used to talk about this all the time, where you have, a good villain is a dark mirror, where, the hero has this heroic motivation that's understandable. The dark mirror has a motivation that's understandable, that's sympathetic, like Professor X and Magneto. Magneto does horrible things, but you understand why he does horrible things. And that was, that's sort of Stan Lee's, favorite, right? His best kind of villain does that sort of thing. You can really sympathize with Doctor Doom. Thanos was created by Jim Starlin, and I think that's part of what makes him so fascinating, is because if you have a character, one of many reasons, if you have a character, if you read Thanos over, he's created in the 70s, if you read Thanos from the 70s to the 90s, he made brief appearances in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, the Annihilation era, that sort of thing. All of the different Infinity miniseries that Jim Starlin did, his motivation will change a lot. His motivation will be quite different. If you read it from a bunch of different writers, you might think the writer just didn't understand Thanos and just decided to give him a different personality. And as a Doctor Strange fan, a lot of people do that with Doctor Strange. Unfortunately, they don't understand Doctor Strange. That's a whole other issue. But Thanos is kind of unique in that a vast majority of Thanos stories were written by Jim Starlin, except for recent years. There's been sort of a lot more Thanos stories in recent years. But most of them, for decades, were written by one man, and that's just unprecedented for characters. But so if you look at Thanos' motivations, he has so many different motivations. If you start with, how much time do we have? This is why I probably need to make a separate video. But if you start with when he's a kid, so in the comics, if you start with when he's a kid, he's an eternal, born with a deviant gene. So, he's born in this perfect place, and he has this big purple face and what have you. The Eternals are kind of an interesting property to adapt for the MCU. That's another movie coming up, because they are essentially racist against deviants. That's a complicated thing, but there is a prejudice, let's say, just to simplify, not to get into a whole complicated other territory, but just to simplify, there is a prejudice among Eternals for deviants. So Thanos was an Eternal, but he was born a deviant. So they treated him as an enemy because he was physically freakish. That could have been just a character. That alone could have been a character. And there's plenty of, comic characters that's their only motivation. Then he became fascinated with science. So he's a scientist. He became fascinated with understanding the universe. And you could say that stems from, this could go on forever, so I'll simplify it, but he became interested in science. Through his studies of science, he became interested in death. Through his scientific study of death, He met the embodiment of death, Mistress Death. He fell in love with Mistress Death. Mistress Death wanted people to die. Thanos was like, I hate everyone. I'll kill everyone for you. And so he became this mass murderer because he was madly in love with Mistress Death. So he's a romantic. I mean, that's in the Infinity Gauntlet. In Infinity Gauntlet, that's his big motivation. Is he wants love from this entity who's incapable of giving love back to him. Who just wants to use him as a tool to kill half the living beings. And the whole balance motivation, and I think just making it balance is a bit weak, because I think Thanos works best when he's so single-mindedly devoted to a cause, and he's so powerful, and he makes himself more and more powerful. There's another motivation, constantly making himself more and more powerful, till he becomes essentially this, all-powerful being. But he makes himself more and more powerful in his dedication to this ideology. And that's kind of what makes him unstoppable. And some people will depict him as this sort of warlord, king type of character. But he's not interested in that. He's not interested in ruling people. He's interested in killing people. So that's what makes him scary. He does not care if you live. He will just kill you. That's what makes him scary. And he's capable of it. So that's the balance thing. I mean, that comes from, partly from Infinity Gauntlet, and that was an idea of Mistress Death. Mistress Death said, the universe is overpopulated, reduce it by half. That came from Mistress Death. And so I don't fault them, the MCU, for simplifying that to just being about balance. Balance is a little bit ridiculous, but if you don't think about it too much, it's fine. As I said, I'm implying that they're stupid, but that kind of works for the Thanos in the movies because it's such a ridiculous thing that he's so dedicated to, and he's so intelligent. I mean, that's the thing about Thanos. He's very, very intelligent. He's so dedicated to this essentially, ridiculous thing that he's willing to destroy half the universe for what is essentially, a bad idea. And as presumably he's been on this mission for years, but he's hadn't really thought about just how ridiculous it is. That kind of works, that works for a zealot character. There are plenty of examples of perfectly intelligent zealots who become dedicated to this concept. They don't really think it through too much. So I forgive that. There are plenty of characters that the MCU really simplified, and it's understandable. It's fine, whatever. Drax the Destroyer, for example. Don't get me started on Drax the Destroyer. Turning him into a joke. He's charming and adorable. But he's so much more interesting in the comic. But that's a Gamora. It's so much more interesting in the comic. Where was I going? So, yeah, Thanos. Just over the course of decades, he's gone through all these different changes, but for the most part, it's been under the guidance of Jim Starlin. Annihilation was under, Keith Giffen mainly. One of my favorite Thanos stories. One of my favorite Thanos moments is an Annihilation. Spoiler alert for that, but Drax the Destroyer kills Thanos. He's capable of that in the comic. In the movie, not so much. He rips out his heart. And Thanos' response is interesting. And I think that's such a great, just single encapsulation of Thanos. That he sees his own heart. Siku, barking at something. He sees his own heart. He's this ultra romantic character, in a sick, disturbing way, of course, but he's driven by romance. His this hopeless dedication to this woman he could never have, which is a reflection of his insecurity. So like Iron Man, he's constantly making himself more powerful because he's so insecure. Um, but he sees his own heart. He says, "Interesting," and that's also the scientist in him. So he's all of these different things, but it works for Thanos because Jim Starlin's a genius, partly. Um, but so that my point for that is just that I was just giving some basic before I was just giving basic examples of that sort of two-part paradox that you could do fairly easily for a character. It's difficult to pull off five motivations, five paradoxical motivations, all of them pulling against each other and also enhancing each other, like with Thanos. It's easier to pull off like a two-part paradox, like Iron Man or somebody like that. But my other point about the arc, one of the false universals you'll hear is that a character should change, and that works really well. That's sort of like a character should have this singular motivation. It works fine if you tell somebody, if you have a weak character who's not quite working, you could say this character needs an arc and needs to change. There's tons of examples of characters who don't change and are great characters. Captain America has this kind of weird, I wouldn't say weird, but this fascinating change on the one hand, but dedication, steadfastness. And I think probably the line to study is, "I can do this all day." It means something different every time he says it, but it's also still true to him in a fascinating way. He's still dedicated to protecting the weak, but he's also he's also not quite sure of it at the same time. By the time you get to Civil War, then he's kind of sick of it in Endgame. But it's still true of him. He could do this all day. By the end battle, he cinches up his broken shield. I was watching clips of that, and I started tearing up, of course, because I'm a weakling. But the other thing about the arc, that is also what I want to point out. Arcs are for close-ended stories, so you'll see these writing books that say, here's how to do an arc. Here's screenwriting 101. A character should feel this at this point and do this and change here, what have you. Only good characters always change, that sort of thing. Which, it can work just fine. There's plenty of examples to point to where it's, that's a fantastic thing to do for a character. But that's also a structural consideration depending on what the structure of your actual story is. If you're writing a single standalone movie, and by the time you get to the end, that's a fine way to end the story. But it's also for a standalone movie, and there's plenty of examples of when that's not true at all. There's plenty of great characters who don't change. People don't talk about those. My favorite one is, I meant to mention this in the last video, Dorothy Gale. There's a perfect example. The actual Captain America. Very dedicated to her ideology, these basic American ideals. In the books, she doesn't change, but that's also a serial story. One of my favorite series of books is the Oz books, and one of my favorite characters is Dorothy. She remains steadfast, like Captain America, to this ideology. She doesn't change from book to book. But if you look at, the Wizard of Oz movie, the 39 version, there are more than one version, but the 39 version, she changes by the end, but it's harder to imagine that particular character going on to another adventure. That's a dark, tragic ending. I should do a video on that one. I talk about that all the time, but I talk about Wizard of Oz all the time. How dark and tragic the ending of that movie is, on so many levels. but that's that's the ending of the story. So the resolution of the lesson, learning a lesson, or changing, or resolving a paradox, that's the end of the story. That's not the purpose. That's not the sole unit of quality for the character. That's just a technical structural moment where a story is no longer happening, and a story is no longer going to be interesting after that. You're no longer able to have a story really. If you keep the story going, if you think about the Lord of the Rings, for example, um, the whole story is taking the ring back to Mount Doom and all kinds of thousands of other things. That ending feels tedious, even though it's beautiful and we love the characters. It feels tedious because we've already had the resolution. So the actual story is over by that point. So structurally, you can look at arcs for each of the movies. So you can look at Iron Man, as I mentioned. He has an arc in the first movie. He has an arc in the second movie. Arc in the third movie. Arc in the Avengers movie, sort of. Yeah. I think all of the Avengers movies, he has an arc. He has a mini arc in each one. He has an arc in the first Spider-Man, or Spider-Man Far From Home, for example, sort of. Growing to accept the surrogate fatherhood or whatever. So he has these mini arcs, but he has this overarching arc that ultimately comes to a conclusion. When he snaps and he says, "I'm Iron Man" the last time. I swear I'm not going to cry. But that's because that is a series of essentially standalone stories that are interconnected standalone stories. 22 interconnected standalone stories, essentially standalone stories. So each one is going to have its own arc because of its standalone structure. The whole overarching story is going to have an arc because it's essentially self-contained. But if you look at that in direct comparison to the structure in the comics, it tends to be cyclical. Doctor Strange is a perfect example of this. The best Doctor Strange stories, he'll have some sort of fall, and then he'll build himself back up again, and then he'll have a fall, and he'll build himself back up again. But the best Iron Man stories, I never really read Iron Man that much. Iron Man was never my favorite character. I like him in the MCU a lot more. I love Doctor Strange in the comics, but I really like Iron Man in the. I kind of like Doctor Strange in the movies. He hasn't quite won me over yet. I'm too close to the character to really fully buy into him yet. I appreciate that it exists, though. I appreciate that Doctor Strange is a household name. That's weird and fascinating and amazing. And unbelievable. But Iron Man in the comics, I'll use this example. Iron Man in the comics, his best stories they're when he falls in some ways. So Demon in a Bottle is the one that always comes up when he's an alcoholic. So, and if you just look at the comics and you use the false dualism of character-driven versus plot-driven, really truly dedicated comic book fans get annoyed when a story is just plot-driven. Like a lot of the big event stories where characters kind of get lost. Hi, buddy. Hi, buddy. Hi, buddy. Hold on. I love you. I love you. Okay. A lot of the big event stories where characters just get lost and it's just about plot. Fans hate that stuff. That's the Michael Bay movie where there's big events and explosions and all kinds of stuff, but the characters get lost. Real dedicated comic book fans hate that sort of stuff because comic book fans are fans of characters going through experiences. So if you look at something like Demon in a Bottle, that's Iron Man going through alcoholism. What else happens in that story? It's the story of when Tony Stark is battling alcoholism. A couple of other things happen. The other one that comes up all the time is the Extremis story, and that was the Iron Man 3 story. I think Siku's pouting because I wouldn't let him in my lap. I'm sorry, buddy. The Extremis, a lot of that is just his had a lot to do with physical trauma, um, and developing this new armor to compensate for this really extreme physical trauma that he goes through. Um, and my favorite one is the Matt Fraction story. If you want a recommendation, I'm not a huge Iron Man comic fan, but the Matt Fraction line, I read that whole thing, or most of that Matt Fraction line, and that's a story of him breaking down and breaking down and breaking down. And by the end of that, I think the last storyline, the first storyline is called Five Nightmares. The last storyline that I really read, I think it kept going, but I think it kept going for a couple of more storylines, but the last storyline was called Stark Disassembled. Yeah. So, in his Stark Disassembled, the story was he was stuck in his head. He was in a coma, and it was ultra introspective. And there was, spy thriller stuff happening outside, and his friends were trying to move his body and stuff like that. But he was broken down so much that he was entirely inside of his head. And I think really the best comic book stories, even if there are these big adventure stories and what have you, will still ultimately, the most beloved will still be character driven regardless. They'll be character and plot. They'll still be character driven regardless. I didn't even talk about Thor. Thor is an amazing character. But I mean, his journey is fairly obvious. It's not as intensely emotional. You don't quite cry at the end of a Thor story the way you do with at the end of Iron Man's story. But I mean, it's fairly obvious what's going on with him. He's, he has the correlative of the hammer, that the only way he's able to wield it is if he's worthy. And his whole world breaks down. And my ex-wife, that's her favorite character. And she, when she found out that the next movie was going to be called Ragnarok, she said, "Oh no, Asgard's going to be destroyed." And I said, "Well, it kind of happens over and over again in the comic." But I mean, Asgard is Asgard. Let me make sure to pronounce that clearly. Asgard. The whole concept of that is cyclical anyway. But it'll fall down. I mean, that happens with Thor. Thor falls. He becomes unworthy in some way. Jason Aaron really does it. The ideal one. And that's the next movie, Love and Thunder, is going to be primarily based on Jason Aaron's stuff. But Jason Aaron, is well known for the unworthy storyline. But there's variations on that just over the years. Thor is cocky. He becomes unworthy. He falls. His whole world falls down, gets built back up, falls down again, gets built back up, just over and over throughout the years. And so those are arcs, but and the character changes, but the changes are more cyclical. They go through these cycles of, a lot of the times it's, and this happens with Doctor Strange too. Doctor Strange as well, not Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Can't wait for that one. Glad to be alive about that one. I should make a video about that one eventually. But it happens with Doctor Strange too. He as well. He goes through these cycles of being, returning to the arrogance of before injuring his hands, falling, being humbled, building back up. And that happens with Thor just over and over again. So they go through changes, but they are essentially stable. I mean, this is what helps retain interest in a character who is essentially not changing. Have a really good, rich paradox there that's really compelling. Drives you to want the character to resolve it. But if the character really truly resolved it, if the character, was able to embrace whatever, they were struggling to embrace, then it would be difficult to tell stories after that. That's something that worries me a bit about the Captain Marvel. There's a really basic example there. She's a very, very powerful character. The best scene in the Captain Marvel movie, when she keeps falling down, or people push her down, or, people keep knocking her down through their ridicule, or through actually knocking her down. and she, has that echo throughout her life of her continuing to get back up again. By the end of the movie, she's extremely powerful, and she's busting through spaceships and what have you. But that's the thing that worries me about Captain Marvel 2. I think Captain Marvel 2 will be fantastic. However, where do you go? Where do you go with the character? Do you bring her back down again? And that particular character, so much of her restraint was about other people's doubts in her, and other people suppressing her power. That now that she's embraced her power, I wonder what the next conflict will be. But anyway, that's beside the point. As I said, I can ramble on forever and ever about all of this stuff, but I'll just wrap it up for today. Thanks for joining us on Simon Rambles about the MCU, and maybe make some good points about storytelling. We'll see you next time on the center of the Rainbow Circle. Dun, dun, dun. Seiko and Maggie say goodnight.